Imagine waking up one morning to find everything you've worked for, everything you've built, under threat by someone who knows your darkest secrets and isn't afraid to use them against you. What happens when a single, unfounded accusation tears apart a family's life? This isn't just a story about one neighbor's cruelty. It's about how one call can unravel everything, and how karma will have the final say. Stick around to see how justice is served in the most unexpected way. Nicole and Derek had worked so hard to get to this point. Their new home in the peaceful neighborhood was supposed to be the fresh start they had dreamed about for years. It wasn't just a house, it was their sanctuary. After years of struggling in the city, juggling two jobs and trying to give their kids a better life, they were finally home. Derek had spent hours putting up the swing in the backyard for their two children, Mia and Jordan, while Nicole had unpacked the boxes, making the house feel warm and inviting. The kids were running around the living room, laughing, their faces lit up with excitement as they explored every corner of their new place. For the first time in a long while, everything felt right. It was a Saturday evening, the sky beginning to turn soft shades of purple and orange as the sun set. Derek was grilling burgers outside while Nicole set the table inside, humming along to an old song that took her back to better days. They were in their own little world, until the sound of footsteps broke through their bubble. From across the street, Mr. Daniels, their neighbor, was marching toward their house with a stern look on his face. He didn't seem to be walking casually, but more like he had something on his mind. He had been eyeing them ever since they moved in, making it clear that their presence in the neighborhood wasn't exactly welcomed. Nicole hadn't thought much of it at first. New neighbors were always a bit wary of each other, especially in close-knit communities. But there was something about Mr. Daniels that made Nicole uneasy. "Excuse me," Mr. Daniels called out sharply as he reached the front porch. His tone was cold, his eyes narrow. Nicole walked out to meet him, smiling politely, but something about his demeanor didn't sit well with her. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "You've been making noise all day," Mr. Daniels snapped, his eyes darting to the children playing inside the house. "It's not what we're used to around here." Nicole was taken aback. They had been moving in, yes, but the kids were inside and Derek was quietly grilling. There hadn't been any loud music or commotion. "I'm sorry. I don't think we've been. I don't care." Mr. Daniels cut her off. "You people come in here, disturbing the peace, taking over. I've seen it before and I won't have it." His words hit Nicole harder than she expected, but she tried to stay composed. "We're just trying to get settled in," she said, her voice steady but now filled with frustration. "We're not bothering anyone." "You've got a lot of nerve," he spat, stepping closer, his voice growing louder. "I've called the police on people like you before, and I'll do it again if I have to." With that, he turned sharply, storming off toward his house, muttering something about disruptive people. Nicole stood there for a moment, stunned. She wanted to go after him, to ask him what the hell he meant by that, but something told her it wouldn't make a difference. Derek, who had heard the exchange, stepped up behind her. "What was that about?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Nicole sighed, shaking her head. "Nothing good, I'm afraid. He says we're disturbing the peace. Can you believe that?" Derek looked toward Mr. Daniels' house, his jaw tightening. "What's his problem? We're just trying to live our lives." "I don't know, but I've got a bad feeling about him," Nicole replied. She looked at their kids inside, their innocence evident as they continued playing. "This is supposed to be our home, our safe place." But as they spoke, they had no idea that Mr. Daniels wasn't done. In fact, he had already stepped inside his house and was dialing the police. His voice, low and angry, spilled out into the phone call as he described the troublemakers who had moved in next door. He wasn't just complaining about noise, he was making it clear that he wanted them gone. Nicole and Derek went back to their evening, but something had shifted in the air. The unease hung over them, like a storm on the horizon. What started as an innocent confrontation was about to spiral into something far worse. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to change forever. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The warmth of their new home no longer felt like a shield. Every sound seemed louder, sharper. Nicole couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. She tried to focus on dinner, making sure the kids had their plates set, but her mind kept drifting back to Mr. Daniels and his words. She could hear him in her head. "I've called the police on people like you before." She didn't want to overthink it. She was just trying to get through the day. But Derek noticed. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle as he flipped a burger on the grill. Nicole took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about that guy." She glanced out the window, but Mr. Daniels' house was dark now. She felt silly for even letting him get under her skin. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, trying to convince herself. But she was wrong. Inside Mr. Daniels' house, things were very different. His anger had only grown since their brief encounter on the porch. After hanging up with the police dispatcher, he paced back and forth in his living room, muttering to himself. His words were filled with venom, as though he was convinced that the presence of a black family in this neighborhood was an affront to everything he believed in. The thought of these outsiders ruining the quiet of his suburban life ate at him. "They don't belong here," he whispered harshly to himself, his eyes narrowing as he stared at their house from his window. He dialed the number again, this time speaking more urgently to the dispatcher. "This is Mr. Daniels from Maple Drive," he said, his voice a little louder this time. "I need to report a disturbance. There's a black family living next door. They've been causing problems all evening. Noise, and they're definitely up to something suspicious. I don't feel safe with them here." His words were carefully chosen, designed to trigger the exact kind of response he wanted. The dispatcher hesitated for a moment before responding. "We'll send someone over to investigate, Mr. Daniels. Thank you for your call." The line went dead, and Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, a smug grin slowly spreading across his face. He believed he had just taken control of the situation. They were just people in his way, people who didn't belong, and now, thanks to him, they would have to face the consequences. He watched their house again, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of power. Back at Nicole and Derek's house, things were about to take a turn they never expected. The sound of a car engine broke the evening silence, and both of them turned toward the window just in time to see two police cruisers pulling up in front of their house. Nicole's heart skipped a beat. "Derek, what the hell is this?" she whispered, feeling a cold wave wash over her. Before Derek could respond, the doorbell rang. The calm evening they had been enjoying just moments ago now felt like a distant memory. Derek walked to the door, the sense of dread growing with each step. Nicole followed closely behind, her stomach twisting into knots. Derek opened the door, and two police officers stood in the doorway. One of them, a tall officer with a stern look, stepped forward first. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice flat. "We've had reports of a disturbance coming from this address. Are you the owner of this property?" Derek stood still for a moment, confused. I'm Derek. What kind of disturbance are you talking about?" He glanced back at Nicole, who was now standing behind him, her face pale. "We received a complaint from a neighbor about loud noise and some suspicious activity," the officer replied, his eyes scanning the house as if looking for something. His partner, shorter and stockier, stood silently behind him, arms crossed. Nicole felt the blood drain from her face. "Loud noise? Suspicious activity? Officer, we've been here for a few hours, just unpacking. There's been nothing. Nothing that would cause a disturbance." The officer didn't look convinced. "We're just here to make sure everything's okay. Can we come inside and check?" Derek hesitated, his mind racing. Check? For what? He didn't want to invite them in, but what else could he do? They were already here, and the last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation. "Just to make sure," the officer repeated, his tone growing more insistent. Nicole stepped forward, trying to stay calm. "Look, we just moved in. There's been no noise, no trouble." The officers exchanged a brief glance, and the shorter officer spoke for the first time. "We'll need to speak to your neighbor, get their side of the story. Can you tell us where Mr. Daniels lives?" Derek's frustration was mounting. "Mr. Daniels, what does he have to do with this?" The officer remained impassive. "It's standard procedure, sir." The exchange was enough to confirm what Nicole already feared. Mr. Daniels had already poisoned their new life with lies. They had no idea how deep this was about to go. The officers turned, their backs now toward the family, and began to walk away. "We'll be in touch," the tall officer said over his shoulder, just as they made their way to Mr. Daniels's house. Nicole and Derek stood in the doorway, stunned. The conversation had been brief, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Was this just a misunderstanding, or had something much worse already begun? They looked at each other, and in that moment, both of them felt the weight of what was happening. The police were already on their way to talk to Mr. Daniels. This wasn't just about a noise complaint anymore. Something darker was in the air, and they had no idea how fast things were about to spiral out of control. The minutes seemed to stretch on like hours. Derek and Nicole stood in the doorway, watching the police officers make their way toward Mr. Daniels's house. The evening, which had started with laughter and hope, now felt tense, as if the air itself had thickened with uncertainty. Nicole closed the door gently behind them, her fingers trembling as she leaned against it. "I don't understand, Derek," she whispered. "We've been here for what? 3 days? And now this? What did we do to deserve this?" Derek ran a hand through his hair, trying to hold on to his patience. "We didn't do anything, but I can't shake this feeling that Mr. Daniels has it out for us. The way he was talking, like he's been waiting for a reason to cause trouble. But why? What's his problem with us?" Nicole shook her head, unable to come up with an answer. "I don't know, but I don't like it. Something's not right." They waited, watching through the blinds as the two police officers approached Mr. Daniels's house. As the minutes ticked by, the unease grew, wrapping around them like a cold fog. Nicole tried to focus on the kids. Mia and Jordan were sitting in the living room, completely unaware of the storm brewing outside, but her mind kept returning to the conversation with the officers. In the distance, they could see Mr. Daniels talking to the officers, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. Nicole could just make out his voice, rising in anger as he pointed toward their house. "He's lying," Nicole muttered, the words escaping her before she could stop them. "He's lying about everything." "I know," Derek agreed, his voice low and sharp. "But we need to stay calm. Let's see what they say when they come back." We'll figure this out." As they waited, time seemed to drag, but it wasn't long before the officers returned, and this time they weren't alone. Mr. Daniels was walking behind them, a smug look on his face. He caught sight of Derek and Nicole standing at the door and made eye contact with Derek. For a moment, there was a flicker of something, anger, maybe, before it was quickly masked by his usual icy demeanor. The officers stopped in front of the house, and the taller officer, Officer Thompson, stepped forward. His voice was different now, colder and more authoritative. "Mr. Daniels claims that you've been causing disturbances, loud noise, suspicious activity. He says he's been hearing it all day, and he's concerned." Nicole felt a knot form in her stomach. "I already told you. We've been here for a few hours, just settling in. No noise, no disturbances." She glanced at Mr. Daniels, whose eyes were filled with quiet triumph. "He's making this up," she said, her voice rising slightly. "This is a personal attack." Officer Thompson glanced at his partner, who gave a small nod before speaking. "We've looked into the situation, and the neighbor seems to have a history of complaints about other families, including people of color. We're just doing our job, but you should know that his concerns are being taken seriously." Nicole's heart sank. "A history of complaints? Are you telling me he's done this before? Made up stories about people?" The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "We'll need to investigate further. But for now, we have to ask you to remain inside while we review the situation." Derek opened his mouth to protest, but Nicole placed a hand on his arm, her mind racing. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "We'll conduct a further investigation," Officer Thompson repeated, his tone colder now. "If anything turns up, we'll proceed accordingly." With that, the officers turned and walked away, leaving Nicole and Derek standing in the doorway, stunned. Mr. Daniels lingered on the sidewalk for a moment, looking directly at them, a smug grin on his face. He didn't say a word, but his look said it all. He was sure they wouldn't last long here. He had planted the seeds of suspicion, and now it was up to the authorities to decide their fate. As the officers drove away, Nicole closed the door behind them and leaned against it, her chest tight with worry. "What just happened, Derek?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't do anything wrong. This isn't right. None of this is right." "I know, baby. I know," Derek said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. He paced across the room, his mind racing. "This feels like more than just a noise complaint. This is about race. He doesn't want us here." Nicole nodded, a sense of dread settling over her like a heavy blanket. "We've done everything right. We're just trying to make a life here. Why is he doing this?" Derek stopped pacing and turned to her, his eyes filled with determination. "We're not going to let him get away with this. We'll fight this. We'll show him he's wrong." But as the evening wore on and the night settled in, Nicole couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The police had left, but the damage had already been done. They were already marked in the eyes of their neighbors, and there was nothing they could do to erase the stain of suspicion that Mr. Daniels had placed on them. As they tried to go to bed, the sounds of their children sleeping peacefully in the other room felt like a cruel contrast to the storm that was brewing just outside their door. What started as an innocent evening in their new home was turning into a nightmare they couldn't escape. And, deep down, Nicole knew that they weren't going to be able to outrun the storm. The following morning was quiet, but the weight of the previous night's events lingered in the air like a storm cloud. Nicole had barely slept, her mind constantly replaying the conversation with the police and Mr. Daniels's smug expression as he walked away. She had tried to push it out of her mind, but every creak of the house, every sound from outside made her jump. She knew things weren't going to be the same. Derek, too, hadn't slept well. He had spent most of the night pacing, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He had told Nicole they would fight this, that they would prove they didn't deserve to be treated this way. But deep down, he wasn't sure how. It felt like the deck was stacked against them. At breakfast, Mia and Jordan were unusually quiet. Normally, they would be running around, playing their favorite games, or asking questions about their new school. But today, they were subdued, their little faces showing concern they didn't quite understand. Nicole and Derek exchanged a glance, both of them trying to hide the worry from their kids. "We're okay, right, Mom?" Mia asked, her voice soft as she played with her cereal. "Of course, sweetheart," Nicole said, forcing a smile. "Everything is fine." But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things were far from fine. The doorbell rang just as Derek was about to head out to work. He opened it to find two uniformed officers standing on the other side, one of them holding a clipboard. "Good morning, sir," Officer Thompson greeted him, his voice neutral, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. "We need to speak with you about the ongoing investigation." "Investigation?" Derek repeated, his heart skipping a beat. "What investigation?" "You were just here last night. There's nothing else to discuss." "I understand your frustration, sir," the officer said, his tone colder now. "But we've received further complaints. Another neighbor has come forward with concerns about your family." Derek's stomach dropped. What kind of concerns? Officer Thompson's partner, a younger officer, stepped forward, his eyes flicking between Derek and the house. "They're concerned about the activity happening here. People coming and going, unusual traffic, things like that. We need to make sure everything checks out." Derek could barely keep his voice steady. "What activity?" "We've been here for 3 days. This is our home. No one is coming and going except for us." The officers exchanged glances, and the younger officer spoke up again. "We understand, sir, but these are the reports we're receiving. We just need to make sure everything is in order." Derek stood frozen for a moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream at them, tell them this was all a lie. But instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "You can come in, but there's nothing to find." The officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the living room, moving methodically through each room as if they were looking for something, anything that would justify the complaints. Nicole stood silently in the hallway, watching them. She had no idea what they were looking for, but she knew whatever it was, they weren't going to find it. The officers moved through the house, making brief, detached comments as they went. The younger officer took note of the family photos on the walls, the children's toys scattered across the floor. He didn't seem interested in the family itself, just in the things that might be used against them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers stopped in the living room. Officer Thompson turned to Derek, his expression unreadable. "We've completed our inspection," he said flatly. "We'll be filing a report based on our findings." Derek felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "You didn't find anything wrong. There's nothing to report." Officer Thompson didn't respond directly. Instead, he nodded curtly. "We'll be in touch." The officers left, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Nicole stood motionless, trying to process what had just happened. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but she knew it would be useless. They had already made up their minds. Once the officers were gone, Nicole and Derek stood in silence. The children, still oblivious to the drama unfolding around them, were now in the living room playing with their toys. It felt surreal, like they were living in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. "They're coming after us, Derek," Nicole said quietly, her voice filled with disbelief. "This is happening." "I know," Derek replied, his eyes dark with anger. "They're using anything they can to make us look like the problem. First it was the noise, now it's suspicious activity. What's next?" Nicole shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "I don't know, but I feel like we're being targeted, like no matter what we do, they'll always find a reason to make us look bad." Derek took her hand, his grip firm. "We can't let them do this to us. We didn't do anything wrong. This is all because of him, because of Mr. Daniels." Nicole nodded, her heart racing. She wanted to believe Derek, to hold on to that sense of hope that they could fight this, but it was hard when everything around them was falling apart. As the hours passed and the day wore on, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare only deepened. They were no longer just a family trying to settle into a new home. They were under suspicion. The whispers of their neighbors, the false accusations, the watchful eyes, they were all closing in on them. And they couldn't escape. What had started as an innocent mistake, a single complaint, had now turned into something much darker. They had no idea how far Mr. Daniels would go to get them out, but the walls were closing in, and no matter how hard they fought, they couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. By the time evening fell, it was clear that things were rapidly spiraling out of control. Nicole couldn't remember the last time she had felt so helpless. The morning's visit from the police had rattled her to the core, and the endless uncertainty of what was coming next weighed heavily on her mind. It was hard to focus on anything, dinner, the kids, even the simple act of breathing, because it felt like they were all living in a bubble that could burst at any second. And then, like a flash of lightning, the rumors started. It began when Mia came running into the living room after playing outside. She was holding a piece of paper in her hand, and her face was scrunched up with confusion. "Mom, what's this?" she asked, handing it over. Nicole took the crumpled paper and unfolded it, her stomach sinking as she read the words written on it. "The Macaluso family has been involved in criminal activity. Watch out for strangers coming to and from their house. Don't let your kids near them." Nicole's heart raced, and she glanced at Derek, who had just walked in from the backyard. He froze when he saw the note, his face going pale. This can't be real," Derek muttered, taking the paper from her. He read it over again as if trying to make sense of it. But it didn't make sense. This was a direct attack. They were being labeled as criminals now. "What the hell is this?" Nicole asked, her voice shaking with anger. Derek was already walking toward the window, peering out through the blinds. He was looking across the street, at Mr. Daniels' house. The blinds in his window were partially open, and Derek could just make out the shape of Daniels talking to someone in the yard. "I knew it," Derek growled under his breath. "He's been spreading lies." Nicole's heart dropped. She walked over to the window, standing beside him. She hadn't seen it before, but now it was clear. The neighborhood was talking. Whispers, rumors, half-truths were swirling around them like an invisible fog. "I don't understand," Nicole said, her voice tight with frustration. "How can people just believe that? We've done nothing wrong." They don't need proof, Derek replied, his voice hard. All they need is a whisper from the right person, and they're already making up their minds. Nicole wanted to scream. She wanted to run over to Mr. Daniels's house and confront him, demand an explanation. But what good would that do? What if it only made things worse? What if he already had everyone in the neighborhood on his side? Meanwhile, Mia and Jordan were still in the living room, oblivious to the tension in the air. They were playing with their toys, but even they could sense the shift in their parents' moods. "I'm going to call the school tomorrow," Nicole said suddenly, her voice determined. "I'm going to make sure they know about this. I'm going to tell them that these rumors aren't true, that we're not criminals." Derek turned to face her, his eyes full of worry. "Nicole, be careful. This isn't just about a few rumors anymore. This is bigger than that. We've got to think about what happens next." Nicole didn't want to hear it. She was beyond the point of worrying about being cautious. Every part of her screamed that she needed to protect her family, especially Mia and Jordan. If this could spread to the school, if these lies were being told to other parents, they could be in danger. Their kids could be ostracized. She couldn't let that happen. "Don't you see, Derek?" Nicole said, her voice soft but firm. "This is how it starts. First, they label us, then they try to get us out. And then, what if they come after the kids next?" Derek took a deep breath and walked over to her, putting a hand on her shoulder. He could see the fear in her eyes and it tore at him. He knew that she was right. They had to stop this now before it got worse. "I'll go talk to some of the neighbors tomorrow," Derek said quietly. "I'll see who's been talking, who's been listening to Daniels. Maybe I can clear things up." Nicole nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. She knew Derek was right. They couldn't let these rumors fester without confronting them head on. But as the night wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just a matter of a few rumors. The seeds Mr. Daniels had planted had already taken root, and they were growing faster than anyone could have predicted. The next morning, as Derek prepared to go out and speak with the neighbors, Nicole received a call that left her shaken to the core. It was from Mia's school. "Mrs. Macaluso, I'm afraid there's been an issue," the voice on the other end of the line said. "We've received some concerns from other parents regarding your family, and we need to talk about the situation." Nicole's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, concerns?" The voice on the phone sounded reluctant. "There have been rumors circulating. Parents are worried about the safety of their children because of the allegations against your family. We need to address these issues before they get out of hand." Nicole's world tilted. This wasn't just about them anymore. The damage was spreading. The rumors were not contained to the neighborhood. They were now reaching into their children's lives. As she hung up the phone, a cold wave of panic washed over her. This was no longer just about a house or a neighborhood. This was about everything they had worked for: their family, their future, their lives. Mr. Daniels had found a way to turn everyone against them, and they were being pulled deeper into a web of lies. Nicole and Derek were no longer fighting to defend their home. They were fighting to keep their lives from falling apart. And it was only just beginning. The next morning, Derek stood outside his front door, his fists clenched at his sides. His breath came out in slow, controlled bursts, and his mind raced with thoughts of everything that had happened over the last 48 hours. The rumors, the police visits, the call from Mia's school, it was all starting to feel like a nightmare that wouldn't end. But today, he was done being silent. He had had enough. Nicole stood beside him, her face pale with worry, but there was determination in her eyes. "Derek, please, be careful. I don't trust Daniels. Who knows what he's been telling everyone? We can't afford to make things worse." "I know, baby," Derek said, his voice tight. "But I'm not going to let him destroy everything we've worked for. We have to face him, or this is never going to stop." With that, Derek walked across the yard and toward Mr. Daniels's house. Nicole followed him, her heart racing. She had no idea how this would go, but she knew one thing for sure. This had to end now. Mr. Daniels was standing in his front yard, his arms crossed as he watched Derek approach. There was no surprise in his eyes, only that same smug look that had infuriated Nicole and Derek since the first time they had met him. "Can I help you?" Mr. Daniels asked, his voice dripping with false politeness. Derek took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I think you've done enough, Daniels. You've lied about us, spread rumors, and now you're involving our kids in this mess. You need to stop." Mr. Daniels tilted his head as if trying to play innocent. "What are you talking about? I haven't done anything to you." "Oh, really?" Derek's voice rose, unable to contain his frustration. "You've been spreading lies about us to everyone in the neighborhood, talking to the police, and now you've gone so far as to call the school and get them involved. You've got people thinking we're criminals. What the hell is wrong with you?" "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," Mr. Daniels said with a shrug, his tone casual, almost mocking. "I've been here a lot longer than you, and I know when something doesn't seem right. I'm just doing my duty." "You're doing your duty?" Derek's voice was growing louder now. "You're ruining our lives for no reason, and you don't even care. This isn't about protecting the neighborhood. This is about you trying to drive us out because of who we are." Mr. Daniels's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Macaluso. I don't know who you think you're talking to, but you'd better watch your step." Derek took a step closer, his anger boiling over. "You've crossed the line, Daniels. You've been doing this to people for years, haven't you? Spreading lies, causing trouble, all because of your own prejudice." "Enough," Mr. Daniels snapped, his face reddening with fury. "You don't know anything about me. You think you can come into my neighborhood and tell me what to do?" Nicole stepped forward now, her voice calm but fierce. "We're not going anywhere, Daniels. We're not going to let you control our lives. We're fighting back, and you're not going to win." For a moment, it looked like Mr. Daniels was going to say something else, but then he paused. His face tightened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it was brief, gone before either of them could catch it. "You'll regret this," he muttered, turning away. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Derek watched him walk back into his house, his fists still clenched. "We've got to take this to the next level, Nicole. He won't stop unless we make him." Nicole nodded. "We're not backing down, Derek. Not now." As they walked back to their own house, Derek's mind was already racing. He couldn't let Daniels get away with this. It was personal now, and he wasn't going to let his family be the victim of someone's hate. But what would be their next move? Where could they go from here? The confrontation had only just begun. The next few days passed in a blur. Derek and Nicole had reached out to the local media, hoping to shed some light on the truth. They had contacted lawyers, and Nicole even met with a community leader, desperate to make sure their voices were heard. But it felt like every time they made progress, something new stood in their way. It was late one afternoon when the first glimmer of hope finally appeared. Nicole had just finished a long conversation with a reporter who had expressed interest in their story when she came home to find Derek sitting in the living room, his expression unreadable. "Derek," she asked, her heart skipping a beat. "What's going on?" Derek didn't answer right away. He was looking down at something in his hands, his face tight with concentration. When he finally looked up, there was a spark in his eyes, a mix of anger and determination. "I've got it," he said, standing up and pacing. "I've been talking to some of the neighbors, and I've found someone who's been keeping an eye on Daniels. He's got a history of doing this, ruining people's lives, spreading lies, getting people out of the neighborhood. I knew there was more to this than just a few complaints." Nicole's heart leaped. "You're serious? You've got proof?" Derek nodded. "I'm getting the full story. People are starting to speak out, and once we have it, we'll be able to turn the tables. Daniels is about to meet his match." It was a small victory, but for the first time in days, Nicole felt like they were gaining ground. She was still terrified of the damage that Daniels had caused, but the idea of exposing him, of taking back control, it gave her hope. The game had changed, but as they looked ahead, they both knew one thing for sure. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning, and the real fight was still ahead of them. With new information in hand, Derek and Nicole wasted no time. They had been beaten down by lies and rumors for days, but now they had the ammunition they needed. The neighborhood that once felt like home now felt like an enemy camp, and the only way forward was to expose Mr. Daniels for the manipulative, prejudiced man he truly was. Derek met with a local reporter, a no-nonsense woman named Maria Alvarez, who had a reputation for taking down bullies and shining light on the hidden injustices in their city. The minute Derek explained his situation, Maria's interest was piqued. She'd seen this story before. People like Mr. Daniels using their position of power to intimidate and control others. "We'll do a full investigation," Maria said, flipping open her notebook. "We'll speak with the other neighbors, pull up any public records on Daniels and see if there's anything we can use. You're not the first family he's targeted, Derek." That was the turning point. With Maria's help, they were able to connect the dots. They spoke with more neighbors who had once been too scared to speak up. Many of them had been victims of Daniels's rumors and accusations in the past, but they'd been too afraid of retaliation to do anything about it. But now, with the threat of the Macalusos losing their home hanging in the balance, they were ready to stand up. Nicole, while still shaken by the earlier threats, threw herself into the fight with everything she had. She met with lawyers who could help with the defamation, and the legal team quickly drafted a letter demanding that Mr. Daniels cease and desist his campaign of harassment. The letter, along with an official complaint, was set to be delivered to him that afternoon. As the days went by, Nicole and Derek felt like they were walking on a razor's edge. Every move they made was part of a delicate strategy to push back against the lies and expose the truth. Yet, despite their progress, they couldn't help but feel the looming sense of dread. The neighborhood was still divided, and many of their neighbors remained silent, watching from the sidelines. It was clear that they weren't all willing to take a stand. On the day the cease and desist letter was set to be delivered, Derek and Nicole stood outside waiting. The sun was beginning to set and the tension was thick. They had no idea how Daniels would react, whether he would deny everything or escalate the situation even further. Then, the door to Mr. Daniels' house opened. He stepped out, his eyes locking with Derek's. There was no hiding the fury in Daniels' gaze. It was as if he had been expecting this confrontation for days. "I told you to watch your step, Macaluso," Daniel sneered, his voice full of venom. "You think you can win against me? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Nicole took a deep breath, standing tall beside Derek. "We've had enough of your lies, Daniels. You've been making our lives miserable for weeks, and it stops today. You're not going to get away with this anymore." Derek stepped forward, holding out the letter. "Here's your official warning. If you don't stop, we'll take you to court. This isn't a game anymore." For a moment, Daniels didn't say anything. His eyes darted from the letter to Derek, then to Nicole, his expression shifting between rage and disbelief. But then he laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "You think you can take me down with a letter?" Daniels scoffed. "You're nothing. Just some outsiders trying to make a name for yourselves. This is my neighborhood, and you'll never belong here." Derek didn't flinch. "You're wrong. We're not going anywhere, Daniels, and the truth is coming for you." With that, Daniels' face twisted into a snarl, but before he could respond, a car pulled up in front of their house. It was the reporter, Maria, and she was holding a camera. Behind her were two other neighbors who had agreed to stand with Derek and Nicole. They were ready to speak up, and the camera was rolling. "You're not the only one with power here," Maria said, pointing the camera at Daniels. "This is the truth, Daniels, the truth that you've been hiding for years." Daniels's face turned red with fury. He took a step forward, but it was too late. The evidence had been gathered. His own neighbors were speaking out. The walls were closing in on him, and that was when Nicole felt a small rush of triumph. The game had shifted. They weren't the ones running scared anymore. Mr. Daniels was exposed, and now it was only a matter of time before he would have to face the consequences. The fallout came swiftly, and it came hard. The story about Mr. Daniels, his history of spreading false rumors, attempting to manipulate the neighborhood, and his bigoted behavior, spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the Macalusos who were affected by his actions. It was a whole community of families that had lived under the shadow of his cruelty. Maria's investigative report aired on local news the following week, and it didn't take long for the public to react. Neighbors who had stayed silent began speaking out, telling their stories of how Daniels had tried to run them out of the neighborhood with lies and accusations. More people came forward to confirm that Daniels had made their lives miserable too, with unfounded complaints and malicious gossip. The media storm that followed was intense. Daniels couldn't hide from the truth any longer. The neighborhood, once divided, now stood in solidarity against him. People started organizing, sharing their stories, and demanding change. No one wanted someone like Daniels living in their midst, poisoning their community with hate. As the pressure mounted, Daniels became more desperate. He tried to call in favors from his friends in the local government, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The authorities were now looking into his past, investigating any potential wrongdoing on his part. Rumors about his own financial problems and shady dealings started to surface, and his once imposing position in the community began to crumble. Derek and Nicole watched it all unfold with a mix of relief and disbelief. They had fought for this moment, fought for their family's future, fought for justice, and now they could finally breathe a little easier. But even with the victory, they knew the journey wasn't over. They had been tested, and though they had won this battle, they still had to rebuild their lives. The whispers from the past would still linger, and some people in the neighborhood would always look at them with suspicion. But, at least now, they were no longer alone. As for Mr. Daniels, his world was falling apart. He was no longer the man in control. He was the one being investigated, the one whose lies had come back to haunt him. And in the end, it was clear. You could only hide the truth for so long before it caught up to you. As the days passed, the weight of the fallout became undeniable. Mr. Daniels's reputation had crumbled to dust, and with it, his influence over the neighborhood. It wasn't just the media storm that had hit him hard. It was the community's collective decision to push him out of the power position he'd once held so tightly. The neighbors had come together in ways that Derek and Nicole hadn't thought possible. People who had been too afraid to speak up now stood united, and that unity was undeniable. The local authorities, after receiving numerous complaints and evidence from the investigation, began to dig into Daniel's past. It didn't take long for them to uncover a disturbing history of shady dealings. There were reports of him filing false complaints against other families, pressuring tenants in his rental properties, and even attempting to extort money from people who were desperate to leave. Daniels had always assumed he was untouchable, but now the truth was coming to light. One afternoon, Nicole received an unexpected call. It was from the police. "Mrs. Macaluso, we need to inform you that we've opened an official investigation into Mr. Daniels. We've uncovered several instances of his involvement in fraudulent activity. He's under scrutiny now for a number of charges, including defamation, harassment, and abuse of power. There may be more to come." Nicole sat down slowly, her hand gripping the phone as her mind processed the words. It was finally happening. Daniels was no longer just a neighborhood bully. He was facing the consequences for everything he'd done. She quickly shared the news with Derek, who was equally stunned but relieved. But they couldn't afford to feel complacent. There was still a long way to go. Daniels's legal team was already working hard to defend him, and they would likely fight tooth and nail to keep him from being held accountable. Meanwhile, Daniels's behavior grew more erratic. He had stopped showing up at neighborhood meetings, and rumors spread that he was having financial difficulties. His house, once meticulously kept, now stood as a symbol of his decline. The neighbors had already begun discussing how to take control of the neighborhood association without him. It was a shift in power that had been a long time coming. Nicole and Derek watched all of this unfold from a distance, knowing that the end for Daniels was near. For them, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. The truth had prevailed, and it had shattered the walls of fear and manipulation Daniels had built around the community. But what Daniels didn't realize was that his own lies had built a house of cards, and now it was collapsing on top of him. As the investigation progressed, Daniels was formally charged with harassment and defamation, and he faced a civil lawsuit from multiple parties. His once influential voice in the community had turned into a quiet whisper. People who had once feared him now openly discussed the possibility of holding him accountable in court. The power he'd wielded for so long was slipping away, piece by piece, and with each new revelation about his past, the walls around him closed in tighter. As the dust settled and Mr. Daniels was no longer a threat, the Macaluso family found themselves standing on the other side of the storm. For the first time in weeks, they could breathe without feeling the weight of paranoia hanging over them. Their neighbors, once divided, had come together. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the community reclaiming its integrity. The victory was bittersweet, though. Nicole and Derek knew that the battle had taken a toll on them. They had lost their sense of peace, and the trust they had in their neighbors had been shattered. It would take time to rebuild that, but at least now the rumors were gone, and they could finally walk around their own block without looking over their shoulders. The kids were the first to feel the shift. Mia and Jordan no longer came home from school with worried expressions, no longer heard whispers in the halls. They were free of the shame their father's name had once carried. Their friends no longer avoided them or made excuses when they came over to play. Life began to return to normal, and for the first time in a long while, Nicole and Derek allowed themselves to hope. Nicole was especially eager to put the past behind them. She had become deeply involved in advocating for others in similar situations, using her experience to educate people about standing up against harassment and defamation. Derek, too, had found a renewed sense of purpose. He volunteered to help rebuild the neighborhood's sense of community, organizing meetings and even helping families who had been affected by the same tactics Daniels had used to get ahead. In the months that followed, the Macaluso family found their footing again. They weren't just survivors, they were warriors. The fight they had fought had transformed them. Nicole and Derek had learned how to fight for what was right, to protect their family, and to never back down when the stakes were high. The neighborhood, now united, began to heal. Families who had once been divided over Daniel's influence started working together again. They supported each other, helped with community projects, and looked out for one another. There was a renewed sense of trust that hadn't been there before. Nicole and Derek knew the scars would remain. There would always be a part of them that remembered the terror, the uncertainty, and the feeling of being cornered. But now, those scars weren't just reminders of their pain. They were symbols of their resilience. As for Mr. Daniels, his fate was sealed. He had lost everything: his influence, his reputation, and, eventually, his freedom. It wasn't the ending he had imagined when he first set out to destroy the Macalusos' lives, but it was the one he had earned. And in the end, the Macaluso family had emerged victorious, not just because they had won, but because they had fought for the right reasons. They had stood tall in the face of adversity, and that strength had reshaped their future. The story of their fight wasn't just one of justice. It was one of empowerment, showing that even in the darkest of times, there's always a way to fight back, rebuild, and come out stronger on the other side. Months had passed since the chaos of Daniels's downfall, but the echoes of the Macaluso family's fight still resonated throughout the community. What had started as a desperate struggle to protect their home had turned into a movement, a spark that lit the fire of courage in those who had long been silenced. The neighborhood, once fractured by fear and distrust, was now more united than ever. People who had never spoken to one another before were now sharing resources, looking out for each other, and working together on projects to rebuild their community's reputation. Nicole and Derek had become more than just victims of injustice. They had become symbols of hope. Their story was being told in local news outlets and community blogs. They were invited to speak at town halls where they shared their experience, not just of hardship, but of triumph. They spoke about resilience, the power of truth, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seemed impossible. The Macalusos had not only reclaimed their home, but they had also helped others find their voices. They were invited to speak at local schools about standing up against bullying, racism, and injustice. Derek had even started a small nonprofit that aimed to provide legal assistance and counseling to families who had been targeted by similar harassment. The Macalusos had turned their painful experience into a legacy of support for others, and it was a legacy that would endure. For Nicole, the work was personal. Every time she spoke to a family struggling with the same issues, every time she saw someone in the community take a stand for their rights, she felt the weight of her own fight lift. It wasn't just about exposing one man's lies. It was about creating a culture of accountability, where no one had to fear the cruelty of a neighbor, a boss, or anyone who held power unjustly. Derek, too, had changed. He no longer saw the world through the lens of the everyday struggle to survive. He now saw the power of community, of people coming together in the face of adversity. He worked closely with local leaders to ensure that the future of their neighborhood would be one of fairness and respect. They weren't just rebuilding a physical place to live. They were rebuilding trust and understanding. But it wasn't just their community that felt the impact. The story of the Macalusos had spread beyond the borders of their town. In online forums, social media groups, and other neighborhoods facing similar issues, people had found inspiration in their courage. It became a rallying cry. If the Macalusos can do it, so can we. Derek and Nicole's fight had become a beacon for others, proof that no matter how big the challenge, the truth would always prevail in the end. As they looked at their children, who were now thriving in school and with their friends, Derek and Nicole couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The sacrifices they'd made, the sleepless nights, the fear, it had all been worth it. They had protected their family, and in doing so, they had made a lasting impact on the world around them. The battle against Daniels had not only changed their lives, but it had sparked a ripple effect that would continue for years to come. The Macalusos had faced adversity and had come out on top. They had not just survived, they had changed the world in the process. And as they sat on their porch that evening, watching the sunset, they knew that the true victory wasn't in the legal battles or the media coverage. It was in the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim, and in the legacy they had created for future generations. Their fight was over, but its impact would last a lifetime. The Macaluso family had fought not just for their home, but for the future of a community that now knew what it meant to stand up, speak out, and never back down. The months of turmoil had finally given way to peace, but the scars of the battle still lingered in subtle ways. Every once in a while, Nicole would catch herself looking out the window, half expecting to see Mr. Daniels standing there, arms crossed and glaring. Derek would pause in his work, listening carefully whenever a car stopped outside their home, as if bracing for another unwelcome visitor. The trauma they had endured was not something easily forgotten, but those moments grew fewer with time. The laughter of their children filled the house once again, and the uneasy silence that had once hung over their neighborhood had been replaced by the sounds of life. Neighbors chatting over fences, kids playing in their yards, and the hum of a community finding its rhythm again. One crisp autumn morning, Nicole decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. It was something she hadn't done in months, not since the rumors had started and the fear had taken root in her heart. But today felt different. The air was lighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. As she passed by the other houses, she was greeted with warm smiles and friendly waves. People who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, asking about the kids, offering kind words, and sharing stories about how the neighborhood had changed. Nicole could feel the difference. It wasn't just that they had won against Daniels. It was that the community had grown stronger because of it. When she reached the spot where Mr. Daniels' house had stood as a symbol of their fear, she stopped. The house was empty now, its windows boarded up, the lawn overgrown with weeds. Daniels had left the neighborhood weeks ago, disgraced and defeated. His departure had been quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it had marked the end of an era of fear and control. Nicole stood there for a moment, taking it all in. She didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just relieved. The fight had taken so much from her family, but it had also given them something in return: resilience, strength, and a bond that no one could break. She whispered softly to herself, "It's over. Finally, it's over." When she returned home, Derek was sitting on the porch, sipping coffee as the kids played in the yard. He looked up as she approached, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "How was the walk?" he asked. "Peaceful," Nicole replied, sitting beside him. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I think we're finally past it, Derek. We've taken our lives back." Derek nodded, his eyes on Mia and Jordan as they ran through the yard, their laughter filling the air. "We have, and we're stronger for it." The two of them sat there in comfortable silence, watching their children, feeling the warmth of the sun on their skin. The fear that had once consumed them was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. They knew life would still have its challenges, but they also knew that nothing would ever break them the way Daniels had tried to. They had faced the worst, and they had won. Not just for themselves, but for their family, their community, and everyone who had ever been silenced by fear. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Nicole leaned her head on Derek's shoulder and smiled. "We're home," she said softly. Derek kissed the top of her head and replied, "Yeah, we are. And no one can ever take that from us again." For the first time in a long time, the Macaluso family was exactly where they were meant to be, together, safe, and free. As the months turned into years, the legacy of the Macaluso family's fight remained. Their story became a symbol of hope for those who had been silenced, a reminder that truth and courage could bring down even the most powerful forces of injustice. Derek and Nicole continued their work in the community, their nonprofit thriving as they helped countless families who faced the same struggles they once did. Their kids, Mia and Jordan, grew up in a neighborhood that was stronger, safer, and more united because of their parents' bravery. Mr. Daniels, on the other hand, faded into obscurity. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how the truth could unravel a person's life if they chose to hide behind lies and cruelty. He had lost everything: his influence, his wealth, and his freedom. But for the Macalusos, the victory wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about reclaiming their peace and their future. They had fought for their right to live without fear, and now they had built something even greater, a community that stood together, stronger than ever. And as they sat together one final evening, looking out over their quiet, peaceful neighborhood, they knew the fight was over. But the legacy of their courage would live on, inspiring others to stand up, speak out, and never back down.